Our family ranch sits on 300 acres of rolling hills in central Texas. 4 generations of my family have called this place home. My great-grandfather bought the land in 1952 when it was nothing but raw pasture and a small creek that wound through oak trees and mesquite. Every morning, I walk out to check on our cattle and watch the sunrise paint the sky orange and pink above the horizon. The peace here runs so deep you can feel it in your bones. This is where my grandpa taught me to rope and brand, where my father learned the value of hard work and honest living. That peaceful morning routine ended abruptly on a Tuesday in March. I was walking toward the south pasture when I spotted 3 men in bright orange vests standing near our fence line. They carried surveying equipment and were driving stakes into our ground without permission. I approached them with confusion rather than anger. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they had the wrong property. "Excuse me," I called out. "This is private land. What are you doing here?" The lead surveyor, a thin man with a clipboard, barely looked up from his equipment. "We are surveying for the new water pipeline," he said matter-of-factly. "HOA sent us. We will be running a major line through this section." My stomach dropped. What pipeline? Nobody asked our permission for any pipeline. He finally looked at me, with the kind of expression you give someone who just does not understand how the world works. "You do not need to give permission. We have easement rights. Check with your HOA." "We are not part of any HOA," I said, my voice rising. "This ranch has been in our family for 70 years. The surveyor shrugged and went back to his work, like I was some minor inconvenience he could simply ignore. I rushed back to the house and found my grandpa in his study, reading the morning paper. At 83 years old, he still had the sharp mind that had helped him navigate decades of property disputes and business deals. "Grandpa, there are surveyors on our land talking about some pipeline." His weathered face grew serious. "Show me." We drove out in his old Ford pickup to where the men were working. By now, they had been joined by a construction crew setting up equipment for what looked like a major excavation project. The foreman, a large man with a hard hat and aggressive attitude, walked over before we even got out of the truck. "This is a construction zone," he announced. "You need to leave." Grandpa stepped out slowly, his boots hitting the ground with authority. "This is our land," he said calmly. "You are trespassing." The foreman laughed. "Not anymore, old man. We have legal right-of-way for this pipeline. Your property is now part of the Meadowbrook HOA development easement." "What the hell is Meadowbrook HOA?" I demanded. "The new housing development going in over the hill. 300 homes. They need water, and we are running it right through here." I felt like the ground was shifting under my feet. How could strangers just decide to run a pipeline through our family ranch? How could we suddenly be subject to some HOA we had never heard of? The foreman turned away dismissively. "You got a problem, take it up with the HOA board. Construction starts tomorrow." As we drove back to the house in stunned silence, I could see heavy machinery being unloaded from trailers. Bulldozers and excavators that would soon be tearing up the land where my great-grandfather had first built his dreams. That night I could not sleep. Through my bedroom window, I could see lights from the construction site where strangers were preparing to destroy our family legacy. I had no idea that this violation would lead to the most satisfying revenge of my life. The next morning, our dining room table looked like a law office had exploded. Legal documents, property surveys, and highlighters covered every inch of the wooden surface that had hosted family dinners for decades. Grandpa spread out our original property deed, his finger tracing the boundaries that clearly showed our 300 acres. "Something is not right here," he muttered, adjusting his reading glasses. "Nobody can just claim easement rights without proper legal process." I had spent the night researching Meadowbrook HOA online. What I found made my blood boil. This was not some small neighborhood association. This was a massive development company planning to build over 400 homes on what used to be farmland just 2 miles from our ranch. Our family lawyer, Jim Martinez, arrived around 10 in the morning carrying a briefcase full of documents he had pulled from the county courthouse. "This is worse than I thought," Jim said, settling into a chair and opening his briefcase. "The HOA filed easement claims on 17 different properties in this area, including yours." "How is that possible?" I asked. "We never signed anything." Jim pulled out a folder thick with papers. "That is where it gets interesting. They claim you did sign, right here." He handed me a document with what looked like my grandfather's signature at the bottom. The paper granted Meadowbrook HOA permanent easement rights across our property for utilities and infrastructure. Grandpa took the document and studied it carefully. After a few minutes, he looked up with fire in his eyes. "This is not my signature," he said quietly. "Someone forged this." The room fell silent. Jim leaned forward, suddenly very interested. "Are you certain?" "I have been signing my name for 83 years, Grandpa said. "This is not how I write. Look at the letter G in my last name. I always loop it twice. This signature only has one loop." Jim made notes frantically. "If this signature is forged, then the entire easement claim is invalid, but proving forgery in court will be expensive and time-consuming." I felt a surge of hope mixed with frustration. We had evidence of their fraud, but the legal system would make us jump through hoops to use it. "There is more," Jim continued. "I did some digging on the HOA board members. The president, Robert Patterson, has financial ties to the development company building Meadowbrook. The vice president owns the construction company doing the pipeline work." "So they are getting paid to steal our land," I said. "It appears that way, but proving conflict of interest requires extensive investigation." Grandpa was studying another document when he suddenly went very still. "Jim, look at this water rights filing." He handed over a paper I had not seen before. Jim read it carefully, his eyebrows rising. "This says the HOA has secured water rights for the entire development from Cedar Springs." "What is Cedar Springs?" I asked. Grandpa smiled for the first time in days. "Cedar Springs is about 15 miles upstream from here. It feeds the creek that runs through our property and several others in the area." So, Grandpa said, his eyes twinkling with the same mischief I remembered from childhood. "Water rights are separate from land ownership. Just because they can run a pipeline does not mean they actually own the water to put in it." Jim caught on quickly. "You are thinking about challenging their water rights claim." "I am thinking about researching who actually owns Cedar Springs," Grandpa replied. "If their entire development depends on that water source, and they do not have legitimate rights to it, then they have built their empire on quicksand." That evening, after Jim left with promises to investigate the forged signature, I found Grandpa in his study surrounded by old maps and property records he had collected over decades of ranching. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "The weak spot," he said without looking up. "Every giant has one. We just need to find where they are vulnerable." He pulled out a water rights map from 1960 and spread it across his desk. "Your great-grandfather used to say that in any fight over land, follow the water. Water is life. Control the water, control everything. I looked at the old map, trying to understand what he was seeing. The HOA thinks they have all the power because they have lawyers and money and political connections, Grandpa continued. But they have made one critical mistake. What mistake? He pointed to a small circle on the map marked Cedar Springs. They assumed the water would always be there. They never considered that someone else might buy the source. The construction noise started before sunrise every morning. Massive trucks rumbled past our house carrying pipe sections and excavation equipment. The peaceful quiet of our ranch was replaced by the constant roar of machinery tearing up the earth. I organized our first community meeting at the Baptist Church on Elm Street. Word had spread that the HOA was targeting multiple properties, and I hoped other landowners would join our fight. 12 people showed up that Thursday evening. Most were older ranchers and farmers who had owned their land for decades. Their faces showed the same mix of anger and helplessness that I felt every day. Martha Stevens, who owned the adjacent ranch, spoke first. They served me papers last week claiming easement rights across my north pasture. Same forged signature trick they pulled on you. Old Bill Morrison nodded grimly. They want to run power lines through my property. Told me if I do not cooperate, they will use eminent domain. The room buzzed with frustrated conversation. Everyone had similar stories of legal intimidation and bullying tactics. We need to fight this together, I said. If we organize, maybe we can afford the legal fees to challenge them in court. Martha shook her head. I talked to 3 lawyers already. They all said the same thing. HOA has deep pockets and political connections. Small property owners like us usually lose these fights. The meeting ended with more questions than answers. People pledged to contribute money for legal fees, but I could see the defeat in their eyes. They had heard too many stories of HOAs crushing individual property owners. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the County Planning Commission. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. I also reached out to local media, hoping someone would care about our story. The first 3 newspapers I called were not interested. The 4th reporter from a small regional paper agreed to write a brief article. The article appeared buried on page 6 with the headline, "Local Ranchers Dispute Development Rights." It made our fight sound like a minor property line disagreement. Meanwhile, construction on our land continued around the clock. I watched bulldozers scrape away topsoil that had taken decades to build up. Ancient oak trees that had shaded cattle for generations were cut down and hauled away like garbage. The emotional toll was overwhelming. This land held so many memories. The creek where I caught my first fish, the hill where my grandpa taught me to shoot, the pasture where my father proposed to my mother under a full moon. The HOA escalated their pressure tactics. We received a letter from their lawyer threatening to sue us personally for interfering with construction. The letter claimed we could be held liable for thousands of dollars in delays and damages. 2 days later, our property tax assessment arrived in the mail. Somehow, our land value had been reassessed at triple the previous amount, meaning our tax bill would increase by over $10,000. Anonymous flyers appeared around town questioning our family's character and suggesting we were being unreasonable troublemakers. The flyers claimed we were holding up progress and preventing families from getting water service. I started getting cold stares at the grocery store and gas station. People who had known our family for decades suddenly acted like we were selfish outsiders. The County Planning Commission hearing was a joke. The HOA brought 5 lawyers and a stack of documents 3 feet high. Their presentation was polished and professional, complete with PowerPoint slides and engineering diagrams. When my turn came to speak, I had 10 minutes to explain why a forged signature should invalidate their entire easement claim. The commissioners looked bored and impatient. The hearing ended with the commission upholding the HOA's easement rights. Their decision stated that proper legal process had been followed and construction could continue. That night, I sat on my porch watching lights from the construction site destroy more of our land. I felt completely powerless against a system designed to favor money and political influence over individual rights. But in his study, Grandpa was hunched over maps and documents, making phone calls and taking notes. When I went to check on him around midnight, he looked up with tired but determined eyes. "I found something interesting," he said, tapping a water rights document with his finger. "Cedar Springs is not owned by the county or the state. It is privately owned." "What does that mean?" "It means the HOA does not actually own the water they are planning to pump through this pipeline. They just assumed they could buy water rights later." He pulled out another document, this one showing property ownership records for Cedar Springs. The current owner is an 80-year-old man named Frank Ellis. He has owned that land for 40 years, and according to these records, he is not too happy with the HOA either. "Why not?" Grandpa smiled, the first real smile I had seen from him in weeks. "Because they promised to buy his water rights for their development, then tried to lowball him when the time came. He refused to sell, so they just went ahead and built anyway, assuming they could force him to sell later through legal pressure." I felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. "So what do we do?" "Tomorrow, we take a drive up to Cedar Springs. I think Frank Ellis and I need to have a conversation." The drive to Cedar Springs took us through winding mountain roads lined with pine trees and granite outcroppings. Grandpa drove his old Ford pickup with the steady confidence of someone who had navigated these hills for decades. Cedar Springs sat in a natural depression surrounded by rocky hills. The spring itself bubbled up from underground, creating a crystal-clear pool about 50 feet across. From there, the water flowed downhill through a series of creeks that eventually fed the entire valley below. Frank Ellis lived in a modest cabin overlooking the spring. When we knocked on his door, a tall, lean man with white hair and weathered hands answered. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, taking our measure before inviting us inside. "You must be the ranchers fighting that HOA," he said, pouring coffee into 3 ceramic mugs. "I heard about your troubles." The cabin was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and family photos covering the walls. Through the window, I could see the spring flowing peacefully in the afternoon sunlight. "They tried to steal your land too?" Frank asked, settling into his favorite chair. Grandpa nodded. "Forged signatures and legal intimidation. Same tactics they probably used on you." Frank's face darkened. "They came here 6 months ago with their fancy lawyers and slick presentations, offered me $50,000 for my water rights. When I said no, they offered $75,000. "That sounds like good money," I said. Frank laughed bitterly. "Good money? Son, do you know how much water flows through this spring every day? Enough to supply 5,000 homes permanently. They want to pay me $75,000 for water rights worth millions." He walked to his window and looked out at the spring. "When I refused their final offer, they got nasty, threatened to use eminent domain, claimed they could take my water rights for public benefit. Their lawyer told me I could fight it in court and spend my life savings on legal fees, or I could take their offer and walk away. Grandpa leaned forward. What did you tell them? I told them to go to hell, Frank said with satisfaction. I have owned this land for 40 years. My water rights are older than their development company. They cannot just steal what is mine because they want it. So how are they getting water for their development? I asked. Frank pulled out a folder full of legal documents. They are not. They built their entire project assuming they could force me to sell. They told their investors and home buyers that water service was guaranteed, but they do not actually have water rights to deliver. The implications hit me like a lightning bolt. The entire Meadowbrook development was built on a lie. Hundreds of families buying homes were promised water service that did not legally exist. What happens when people try to move into those homes? I asked. Without water rights, they have no water service, Frank explained. The development company will go bankrupt. The HOA will collapse, and all those families will discover they bought houses that cannot legally be occupied. Grandpa was studying the water rights documents with intense concentration. Frank, are you planning to sell your property anytime soon? At my age, I think about it. My kids live in California. They have no interest in maintaining this place after I am gone. What would you want for the whole property, land and water rights included? Frank was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. I always figured it would be worth around $300,000, maybe a bit more to the right buyer. I almost choked on my coffee. $300,000 was more money than our family had ever spent on anything except the ranch itself. Grandpa remained calm. That seems like a fair price for what you have here. We spent the next hour discussing water law and property rights. Frank explained how water rights worked in Texas and how controlling the source gave you control over everything downstream. The HOA made a critical error, Frank said. They assumed water rights could be taken or bought cheaply when needed. They never considered that someone might refuse to sell or that someone else might buy the source out from under them. On the drive home, I was quiet for the first few miles, processing what we had learned. Grandpa, we do not have $300,000. We have the ranch, he said simply. You want to mortgage our land to buy a spring. I want to mortgage our land to save our land, and to teach these bullies a lesson they will never forget. That evening, we sat around our kitchen table with all our financial records spread out. The ranch was worth approximately $800,000. We had savings of about $50,000. If we took out a mortgage, we could potentially borrow enough to buy Cedar Springs. This is incredibly risky, I said. If something goes wrong, we could lose everything. Grandpa nodded thoughtfully. Son, they are already trying to take everything. At least this way we fight back on our terms. What if we buy the spring, and they still find a way to get water somewhere else? There is nowhere else. Cedar Springs feeds the entire valley. Without it, their development is worthless. I stared at the financial paperwork, trying to imagine the courage it would take to risk our family ranch on this plan. If we do this, there is no going back, I said. Grandpa smiled, the same expression he used to have when teaching me to ride horses or fix engines. Sometimes you have to risk everything to save what matters most. Your great-grandfather took that same risk when he bought this ranch in 1952. Everyone thought he was crazy to spend his life savings on raw land. I looked out the window toward the construction lights still destroying our pasture. When do we start? The mortgage application process felt like a covert military operation. We could not let the HOA discover our plan, which meant keeping our activities completely secret from everyone in the community. Our banker, Sarah Chen, had known our family for 20 years. When we walked into her office requesting a $300,000 mortgage against the ranch, her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "This is a significant loan against your property," she said, reviewing our financial documents. "May I ask what you plan to purchase?" Grandpa leaned forward in his chair, his voice steady and confident. "Water rights and property that will protect our ranch from development pressure." Sarah made notes on her computer screen. "The ranch appraises for approximately $800,000, so the loan amount is reasonable. Your credit history is excellent. I do not see any major obstacles." "How long will the approval process take?" I asked. "For a loan this size, probably 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the underwriters have questions." 2 weeks felt like forever when construction equipment was destroying more of our land every day. But we had no choice except to wait and hope the HOA did not discover what we were planning. Frank Ellis agreed to keep our discussions confidential. He understood the strategic value of surprise in our fight against the HOA. "They have been calling me every few days trying to pressure me into selling," Frank told me during one of our secret phone conversations. "I just keep telling them I am thinking about it." Meanwhile, I had to act normal around town, while inside I was buzzing with nervous energy. At the feed store and post office, neighbors asked about our legal battle with the HOA. I gave vague answers about still fighting in court, never mentioning our real strategy. The most terrifying moment came during the second week of our loan process. I was at the hardware store buying fence repair supplies when Robert Patterson, the HOA president, walked up to me. "I heard you filed some kind of appeal," he said, with that same condescending smile I remembered from our first meeting. My heart pounded, but I kept my expression neutral. "Just exploring our legal options." "You should save yourself the trouble and legal fees. We have all the permits and approvals we need. Your little property dispute is not going to stop progress." He walked away without another word, but I spent the rest of the day worried that he somehow knew about our plan. Sarah called on a Thursday morning with the news we had been waiting for. "Your loan is approved. We can schedule closing for next Tuesday if that works." I wanted to shout with joy, but kept my voice calm and professional. "Tuesday is perfect, thank you, Sarah." Frank agreed to meet us at the title company office in the county seat, a small town about 30 miles from our ranch. The closing was scheduled for 10 in the morning. That weekend, I could barely sleep. Everything we had worked for as a family was riding on this one transaction. If our plan failed, we would lose not just our fight with the HOA, but potentially our entire ranch. Grandpa seemed remarkably calm. Sunday evening, we sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple. "Are you nervous?" I asked. "I am excited," he said. "Your great-grandfather would have loved this plan. He always said the best revenge is the kind that serves justice at the same time." Tuesday morning arrived clear and cold. We drove to the title company office in Grandpa's pickup truck, our loan documents in a manila folder on the seat between us. The title company office was a small building downtown with wood paneling and family photos on the walls. Frank was already there when we arrived, looking distinguished in a clean button-down shirt and his best boots. The closing process took about 2 hours. We signed dozens of documents transferring ownership of the Cedar Springs property and water rights. The loan paperwork established our mortgage against the ranch. When the title agent handed us the deed to Cedar Springs, I felt a surge of emotion that was hard to describe. Relief, excitement, terror, and determination all mixed together. Frank shook our hands warmly as we prepared to leave. "I hope you use this to teach those bullies a lesson they will never forget," he said. After the closing, Grandpa and I drove directly to Cedar Springs to see our new property. We parked near the spring and walked to the edge of the clear water. "We own this," I said, still not quite believing it. "We own the source of life for their entire development," Grandpa corrected. "Every drop of water flowing toward their pipeline now belongs to us." The irony was almost overwhelming. The HOA had stolen our land to build their pipeline, never realizing we could simply buy their water source and make their pipeline worthless. We spent an hour walking around the property, making plans for how to reveal our new leverage. The timing had to be perfect to achieve maximum impact. "When do we tell them?" I asked. Grandpa smiled, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "We wait until they finish their pipeline. Let them spend every penny getting their system ready. Then we introduce ourselves as their new water supplier." 3 days later, construction crews completed the pipeline connection. According to their schedule, water service to the development was supposed to begin the following Monday. That Sunday night, I could barely contain my excitement. Tomorrow, we would turn the tables on the people who had tried to destroy our family ranch. Justice was about to be served, ice cold and crystal clear. I chose Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock to make the phone call that would change everything. The HOA office would be busy with their normal routine, dealing with new homeowner complaints and scheduling maintenance for their development. Robert Patterson answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the same arrogant confidence I remembered from our previous encounters. "Patterson speaking." "Mr. Patterson, this is calling about your water supply situation." There was a brief pause. "Who is this?" "This is the new owner of Cedar Springs. I believe you have been expecting to purchase water rights from the previous owner, Frank Ellis." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear his brain processing the implications. "What do you mean, new owner?" "I mean Frank Ellis sold the property last week. Cedar Springs now belongs to me, all water rights included." The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds. When Patterson spoke again, his voice had lost its confident edge. "Who exactly am I speaking with?" "This is the grandson of the rancher whose land you stole for your pipeline. The one with the forged signature you used to claim easement rights." I heard papers rustling frantically in the background. "This is impossible. We have agreements in place for water service." "You have agreements with someone who no longer owns the water. I am the new owner, and I did not agree to anything." Patterson's voice rose to nearly a shout. "You cannot just cut off water to 300 families." "I am not cutting off anything. I am simply informing you that if you want water from Cedar Springs, you will need to negotiate a new agreement with the current owner." "This is extortion." "This is business. The same kind of business you used when you forged signatures and stole easement rights." I could hear him breathing heavily through the phone. "What do you want?" "I want you to remove your pipeline from our ranch. I want compensation for damages to our property, and I want a formal apology for the illegal tactics you used against our family." "That is impossible. We have millions invested in this development." "Then you should have secured your water rights before building. Poor planning on your part does not create an emergency on mine." I hung up the phone and immediately called our lawyer, Jim Martinez, to let him know the revelation had begun. Within 30 minutes, my phone started ringing constantly. Patterson called back 6 times in the first hour, each call more desperate than the last. I let them all go to voicemail. By noon, 3 HOA board members had driven out to our ranch. They stood at our front gate looking frustrated and confused, but I did not go out to meet them. Instead, I watched from our kitchen window as they talked frantically among themselves before driving away. The real entertainment started that afternoon when local media finally began paying attention to our story. The same reporters who had ignored our previous calls suddenly wanted interviews about the family that had bought an entire HOA's water supply. Channel 7 News arrived first, followed by reporters from 2 newspapers and a radio station. They set up cameras near our front porch while I explained how we had turned the tables on the bullies who tried to steal our land. "So you now control the water supply for the entire Meadowbrook development?" asked the TV reporter. "That appears to be the case," I said calmly. "We own Cedar Springs and all associated water rights." "What are your plans for the water service?" "We are open to negotiating a fair agreement with the HOA. But first, they need to remove their illegal pipeline from our ranch and compensate us for damages." That evening, the story led the local news broadcast. The footage showed our ranch, the construction damage from the pipeline, and the massive housing development that now had no legal water source. My phone rang all night with calls from reporters, lawyers, and angry HOA residents. I answered the media calls but ignored everything from the HOA. Tuesday morning brought an emergency HOA board meeting. According to neighbors who attended, the meeting was chaos. Board members shouted at each other while homeowners demanded explanations for why their water service was uncertain. Patterson called me directly during the meeting, his voice now completely desperate. "We need to resolve this situation immediately. Families are starting to panic." "I agree. Remove your pipeline from our ranch and we can discuss water service." "The pipeline cost us $200,000 to install." "Then you should not have installed it on stolen land." "We followed proper legal procedures." "You forged signatures and filed fraudulent easement claims. That is not proper legal procedure." The conversation ended with Patterson hanging up in frustration. Wednesday brought lawyers. 3 different law firms representing the HOA called to schedule meetings. They wanted to discuss mutually beneficial arrangements and reasonable solutions. I agreed to meet with them Friday afternoon at our lawyer's office. The delay gave us time to prepare our negotiating position and let media attention build even more pressure on the HOA. Thursday's newspaper featured a front-page story about our water rights battle. The headline read, "Local Ranch Family Outsmarts HOA Bullies." The article detailed the forged signatures, illegal easement claims, and our strategic purchase of the water source. Public opinion shifted dramatically in our favor. Social media posts praised our David versus Goliath victory. Comment sections overflowed with stories from other families who had been bullied by HOAs. By Friday morning, I felt like we had achieved the impossible. The same people who had dismissed us as powerless troublemakers now desperately needed our cooperation to keep their development from collapsing. The meeting with their lawyers would determine whether justice would be served with negotiation or through the courts. Either way, we held all the cards now. The conference room at Jim Martinez's law office felt different this time. Instead of us sitting alone facing overwhelming odds, 3 HOA lawyers sat across from our single attorney, while Grandpa and I held all the power. Robert Patterson looked like he had not slept in days. The other board members fidgeted nervously with their papers and avoided eye contact. Their lead attorney, a stern woman in an expensive suit, attempted to project confidence, but I could see the desperation in her eyes. "Let us discuss reasonable terms for water service," she began. Jim Martinez smiled calmly. "Our clients are happy to provide water service after the HOA meets certain conditions." He slid a folder across the table containing our demands. First, immediate removal of all pipeline infrastructure from our client's ranch property. Second, restoration of damaged land to its original condition. Third, compensation of $50,000 for damages and legal fees. The HOA lawyer read through our demands, her face growing paler with each item. "These terms are unreasonable. The pipeline removal alone would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars." "The pipeline was installed illegally on stolen land," Jim replied. "Its removal is not negotiable." Patterson leaned forward desperately. "We have 300 families depending on water service. You cannot just leave them without water." Grandpa spoke for the first time during the meeting, his voice calm but firm. "Those families are victims of your poor planning and illegal tactics. We have no desire to punish innocent people for your mistakes." "Then what do you propose?" asked the HOA lawyer. "Remove the pipeline from our ranch and run it around our property instead. Restore our damaged land. Pay compensation for what you stole. Do that, and we will provide water service under a fair long-term contract." The room fell silent as they considered our terms. The HOA had no choice, and everyone knew it. "We need time to discuss this with our full board," Patterson said. "You have 24 hours," Jim replied. "After that, we begin legal proceedings to halt all water service until these matters are resolved." The meeting ended with handshakes that felt more like surrender than negotiation. That evening, Grandpa and I sat on our porch watching the sunset. For the first time in months, the construction noise had stopped. Work crews had been pulled off the job while the HOA figured out their next move. "Do you think they will agree to our terms?" I asked. "They have to," Grandpa said. "Pride is expensive, but bankruptcy is permanent." The call came the next morning at 8 o'clock. Patterson's voice sounded defeated but resigned. "We accept your terms. When can we start making arrangements?" "Our lawyer will send over the formal agreement this afternoon. Once it is signed and the pipeline is removed from our property, water service can resume." The pipeline removal took 2 weeks. I watched with deep satisfaction as the same construction crews who had torn up our land now carefully extracted every section of pipe and restored our pastures. The land restoration took another month. New topsoil was brought in, native grass was replanted, and young oak trees were planted to replace the ones that had been cut down. The $50,000 compensation check arrived on a Friday afternoon. Grandpa deposited it in our ranch account with a smile that could have lit up the entire county. But the real victory was watching our land return to its natural state. Cattle grazed peacefully where construction equipment had once dominated. The creek,